So we're very pleased to welcome you to the Atlantic Council, and I'm Peter Schechter. I'm the director of the Adrian Arch Latin American Center here at the Council. And this morning, my colleagues and I here at the Latin America Center are really pleased to present a Venezuela event that is a bit different from other Venezuela events that have occurred over the last few months. Over those months in Venezuela, it's been the political news that really has gotten a lot of the headlines. The protests of brave students and the dramatic repression of those protests by government forces, the arrest of Leopoldo Lopez, Maria Corina's visit to the OAS, the new negotiations between the MOOD and the government, the slow, painful disappearance of any vestige of free press left in Venezuela, the UNASUR foreign minister's visit, now perhaps they're not visiting, and then maybe they are visiting, the sanctions bill that's winding itself through the US Congress is a direct result of all of those political events. The protests began in February, and 100 days later, what is becoming very, very clear to all of us is that the expression political economy has never been more apt. Indeed, it seems that the greatest motivating factor in Venezuela's politics is the precarious state of Venezuela's economy. Many ask a very good question, which is, are Venezuela's politics, are they fixable with some type of national economic consensus? I think an even better question is whether Venezuela's economy is fixable without some type of national political consensus. And the lack of one thing feeds into the other. This is a key country for the United States, a key country for the Caribbean, a key country for the US, the US's closest ally, Colombia. And Venezuela today is awash in inflation, debt, crumbling exchange rates, scarcity, constricting restraints on the private sector. And the seemingly unfixable nature of Venezuela is causing many to head for the hills. Yesterday, you might have read that Alitalia is yet another airline that has now announced that it can no longer fly to Venezuela because it can no longer go unpaid for those flights. So how does this get fixed? Are we at the bottom of the barrel? Are we climbing up from the bottom of the barrel? Where do we go from here? What needs to be done? Can the private sector in Venezuela recover? And perhaps the central question that we all are asking ourselves, and the one that you're going to hear me asking in one way or another in a recurring fashion this morning is, do the people in the government of Venezuela today understand that they are at a moment of inflection? And do they have the capacity to correct course? Or is Venezuela heading for the cliff's edge? So we have an extraordinary panel here today that's going to try to give us some of the answers to these questions. And I'm really grateful for Felipe Perez, Jorge Roig, Luisa Palacios, my old friend Luis Vicente Leon, for joining me here. Luisa has come from New York, but the rest have come from Caracas and arrived last night. You can read their bios. I just want to say a few words about each. Felipe Perez was the Minister of Planning in 2002, 2003 in the first administration of the late President Hugo Chavez. He did his postgraduate studies at Chicago. He's a Chicago boy. And a deep critic of the Maduro administration's economic policies. Jorge Roig is the president of Fede Cámaras. This is the Federation of the Venezuelan Chambers of Commerce. We could have no better spokesperson for the private sector because he knows every shackle, every constraint, every restriction that's been imposed on Venezuela's business community. Luisa Palacios is the head of energy at Medley Global Advisors in New York. Venezuela rises or falls on oil, and Luisa's insight into its oil production and the challenges for the country and for the region, in particular the Caribbean region, is key. Luis Vicente is one of the country's top pollsters. His voice in data analysis's opinion is listened to carefully on all sides. He does a monthly poll on scarcity, and so in addition to his political opinions, I want him to be the voice of Venezuela's consumers here today as well. Now, just a couple of administrative remarks. Most of the rest of today's session is going to be in Spanish, And for those who prefer, we have simultaneous translation, so please raise your hand if you do need simultaneous translation, and somebody will bring you some speakers. We'll welcome your questions in any language, and maybe you'll even get some answers in English, but basically we'll do the rest of the morning in Spanish. The session is being live streamed via the Atlantic Council's website. We will welcome questions for those of you tuning in via Twitter, and you can use the hashtag VZWhatNow. And with that, thank you all very much, and thank you, the panelists, for joining me today. Bueno, voy a empezar contigo.
I'm going to begin with you, Felipe. You have been a minister. You have been this supervisor and overseer of the situation, and you obviously Venezuela is stepping backwards with inflation, this inequality, lack of investments. It's basically going backwards the whole time. So the question that all of us have, that those of us who do not live in Venezuela, that see what's happening, is where are we? Where is the situation as a crisis? Are we at the lowest point? Is there further to go down? How and where are we heading? Describe to us what the total crisis could be. If we're not at the bottom of the barrel, what is the bottom of the barrel in Venezuela? Thank you, Peter. It's excellent to be with you here this morning. Yes, we are in a very, very serious situation from an economic point of view, not only economic, but political and social as well. It's not a situation, basically, that is just basically for today or new. It's been coming for a long time. The question is, if we are at the cliff at this point, I think we're at the border of the cliff at this point. We're not in the cliff. We're not down the abyss yet, but we're close. We have to talk about what do we consider the abyss. Well, the reality is that it's a hyperinflationary process. It's a complete paralysis of economic factors in the country. It's a process where the government has been lowering its ability to collect taxes and therefore cannot maintain the expenditures that the country has been seeing, particularly social expenses which have maintained the government afloat. This hyperinflationary process is a disaster. As any of us can imagine, when everybody benefits, the people, the poor, nobody gets anything out of it. There's regression in distribution everywhere in the world. We've seen political crisis. This is something that's known. It's been mentioned, commented. These are processes that have been studied from an economic point of view and a political point of view. That's what produced, let's say, Nazism. That's how it began, with hyperinflation. There have been political changes that we've seen in many countries where this has been a factor. That would be the abyss, and we are right at the edge at this point. If you want me to give you a summary, but I'm going to tell you why. It's because of the fact that we're seeing the three basic reasons for hyperinflation to occur. First of all, a deficit that's tremendously high. The deficit of the government has reached about 15% of the products, and that's an incredibly high level for any standard that you might set. In Spain, we've seen it. It was a 7% deficit for the GDP. But this is not a situation that's occurred all of a sudden. This is something that's become a part of and started back in 2006 with an incredible deficit that implies that with high oil income, which of course is the highest income for the government, you have to see that the expenses go way beyond that income. As far as petroleum and oil is concerned, for example, it's about $100 a barrel, historically a very high price. And with that money that's coming in, they still can't pay for the expenses. So Chavez's government and Maduro's had a social virtue where they tried to take all of the income from oil, and it had a tremendous social impact on the poor. That's why they had such a strong basis. However, that is not a sustainable expenditure, and that has become much more serious. So the second classic cause for hyperinflation is deficit. The deficit is so large, has been financed through money of the central bank. In other words, they have no backing. 70% of that deficit last year, for example, $40 billion was the amount, and the plan this year was $90 billion. That produces inflation no matter how you look at it, with whatever economic theory you might consider. The third cause that I'm seeing is that people react when that circumstances occurs, and they start to hoard their assets to reserve dollars, any type of product for housing, buildings, even toilet paper. They actually start hoarding because the demand for real money is going down. So we're at the doors of total disaster, but the government has corrected something. Haven't they changed some of the exchange rates? Have they tried to control prices? We don't know how far, but with the steps they've taken, have they been enough? Have they done enough as far as the government is concerned? Excellent question, Peter. No, not enough, not even close. The liberation of the exchange rate, for example, CICAD 2 was a hope for us because we felt that perhaps it would at least allow us to look at the market and watch the market actually do what it's supposed to do. However, the information we've received is that even at CICAD 2, they are not doing things the way they're supposed to. They're basically not allowed to offer dollars to those that would like to do it. And the demand, obviously, they're not provided with what they should be provided. We thought that if it was done correctly, that could mean that they would be able to have 5 or 6% of the GDP, which would close the gap to some degree. And that would stop the emissions of currency, but it's not being done correctly. So practically, they are gathering money about 1% of the GDP, and that will never close the gap at the fiscal level. It's not enough. Relaxing the price fixing, those are steps that they're taking that are, yes, in the right direction. They're very important. The government has really said controlling prices for exchange rates, for example, and products produced does not resolve the inflation rate or providing of assets. But these steps are not enough. Well, let me ask you something. And this is a question that I suppose that the steps that are required are steps that would cause, obviously, some level of pain. We're talking about increasing the gasoline rates, for example. We're talking about measures that they are thinking of taking that are going to have a political pain and pressure. Is this government strong enough to do what it has to do in order to change the direction? Other than the fact whether it wants to or not, can it? Is it able to do it? I think they do. I think that obviously they're going to have to take economic decisions to resolve this imbalance, and it's costly. They have to be willing to take actions that will have a negative impact on the quality of life of the people. And short term, they'll have prices that will be displaced, decisions that are not very favorable to the people. And after so many years of deterioration, with the quality of life going down, are very sensitive to these situations. Nonetheless, if we check the idea of the government's backing, to answer your question, we have to look at it from 2 points of view. First of all, the popularity of Maduro and his government, if it's capable of resisting deterioration of collections. And the second is the backing of the military, which is key to the governance of Maduro. From the point of view of popularity, President Maduro has had like a roller coaster ride as far as his popularity. In other words, he had won the election with a minimal amount of votes. I believe it was 51%, beyond the debate that came out in Venezuela at the time regarding the quality of the election. The popularity then, after all the surveys, was similar regarding the votes, the level of popularity with the popular backing of the people. So it tells you not that they didn't have problems. Maduro had problems, but he had 51% of popular acceptance at the time when he won the election. And the only thing is, it's gone down since then. Through October, Maduro had lost approximately 12 points. He was down to 39% approval rate because evidently people were not seeing the solutions to their problems. It was getting worse. The economic situation in the country was worsening. So he won the municipal election. When there is a municipal election, it's an aggressive posture. What we call in Venezuela measures that were forcing to liquidate merchandise at lower prices. He's trying to construct a scapegoat in the private sector. So trying to show that they had given everything that they could, that it was the private sector that had stolen from the people, that were exploiting the people, etc. So that economic decision was the worst that could have been done. And we're seeing part of the impact and the results of those measures in the fact that they basically have huge inflation, lack of trust in the government from the manufacturer. But the point of view politically was great. He goes up again to 12 points more than he had lost in about a month. And he won the municipal elections in December for over 10 points compared to the opposition party. So it's a relevant political cost, obviously. You're going from a presidential election where you had lost, quote unquote, by a point, but the situation was they went towards a second election in December that had been done as a plebiscite based on Maduro's government, and it lost at 10 points, and it wasn't even questioned. So the number of votes that Chavismo got in the municipal elections were not even questioned by the opposition. Consequently, Maduro succeeded from the point of view of recuperating his popularity and being able to show that the government was still a strong government in its connection to the people. What happened then after these 4 months? It's been terribly negative as far as the economy is concerned. As Felipe has already mentioned, everything became much more serious. The lack of a situation that of record inflation. It has the highest inflation in the world right now. They haven't even published the last one, but it's obvious that we're going to go over 60% inflation throughout the year when the central bank gives the data, which it hasn't. So basically, we have a very negative impact to the population, and obviously that impacts Maduro's popularity, which in April reached 37 points. So it's very similar to what he had before the situation that caused the caso. So the tendency is very negative, and we could talk a lot about what does it mean, what are the risks to Chavismo falling, popularity that's much lower than Chavez had, but 37%. Just to give you an example, in Washington, the Obama's popularity is pretty much about the same rate. He's much more than Ollantamala, for example, in Peru, and the Prime Minister in Canada. So 37% continues to be, for a government that's working, it is very strong backing without an election in the future.
We're going to return to the subject. A question. I think it's important. We are in Washington. It's very difficult for a non-Venezuelan understand what's happening in the sector, in the private sector in Venezuela in the last year. Can you give us a brief summary of the change, the problems that you in the private sector have seen. I have bad news for Venezuela. Venezuelans can't understand. It's impossible for them, even for them, to understand. What I have to say, for we have 15 years where we can't sit together with the government, and that means only there are no policies. The government started with a readjustment problem with economic model that precisely its aim is to destroy the private sector. And for any politician, that seems attractive, having enough dollars and you can import everything to just have plentiful supplies for all Venezuelans and to destroy all the productive sector that it goes against his government. The business sector has a very important role in some of the events that we have tried to minimize, but Chavez in 2002, then Fede Cámaras, for them, Fede Cámaras and the business sector is their political enemy. Because in any country in the world, the business sector influences the political sector, not has the political effort. We have it's very difficult to sit with them because there is a defined sector, a defined model of import. We've had, right today, all the production chains are non-existent for all products made in Venezuela. Some figures, 430 industries have disappeared in the last 10 years. When we say industries, I want to understand what is an industrial job. It's not like construction or business, commerce, trade. It requires training, preparation, school. 430 have 248,000 businesses have disappeared. That's the highest death rate in an economic model. And all these production chains have been destroyed. So that putting little patches, hot pads, you're going to fix it and give it some dollars, you can reconstitute it, you can fix the problem. This is like a bicycle, I was saying. You can understand better when you're uphill and the chain breaks of the bicycle. Obviously, you can pedal as much as you want, but the bicycles will start going backwards. You can give money to the foodstuffs, but you don't give money to the packagers, the producers. And if you give it to them, you don't give it to the ones who prepare the labels, or you don't give it to the ones who put the cap on. So the product doesn't get to the shelves. So trying to reconstitute that and bring it back is very difficult. I was telling Felipe, we share that there are many resources. Venezuela has our resources, but to reset the productive change is very difficult. This is like the Iron Curtain. You don't get toilet paper. It's because the plants are not producing, but what gets on shelves, it's gone because people are grabbing them. You can't, it's incredible that a country that has $98 billion of inputs doesn't have toilet paper. And the lack of supplies, it's not that there is no toilet paper, there are no car batteries, no spare parts. Up to 2 years ago, 6 months, there was no possibility legal to buy dollars to legally. So everybody had to go through a black market, parallel market, do things, behind the lay. And so you found a washing machine. How much did you pay for it? If you buy it in a parallel market, you will be arrested because you were doing it illegally. And if you had preferential dollars, you were arrested because it was a waste. There was no way to be clean. You would be arrested, no way. You'd be detained. So the situation is very complex. The subject to rebuild the production chain is very hard, very difficult. It's a major change that maybe the archangels can imagine, foresee it, but that's very hard for us mortals to do it. If you find something, please tell me. If you get something, tell me, because nobody can find $1 in SICAP. It's a lottery. You participate in it. Maybe the government generously will give you some dollars. SICAP is like an auction that doesn't work well because the offer, they don't allow it. Now we have a SICAP 3. That's a parallel one, if we should call it that way. But how you talk about how can you start rebuilding, putting a spark back in the production chain? If you sit at the table, what do you find? Rationally, there are too many problems altogether. Let's start with the basic ones for the human. Medication and foodstuffs. I understand right now Rolex, there's no money to bring spare parts for their watches who are not working. But it's not. But you don't have penicillin. You don't have basic products. Let's get to the basic need sectors. Let's start with them. Maybe the government, where they're anxious to have a war with the economic, they don't resolve the problem to anybody. So if you're going to give the medication, not only for the importer of the lab, the people who put the labels, you have to give it to the, the packaging of the medicines, to the plastic, and then you can resolve the problems, little by little. It's like, you can't, it's like a crossword puzzle, like a puzzle. You have to check every piece. You have to have a lot of discipline to be able to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Jorge talked to us about the lack of supply. You do these polls. What does a Venezuelan consumer think? How does he consider the present situation? How far can he go when they don't find meat, toilet paper, go to 4 supermarkets to find milk? What's happening? Obviously, the scarcity, lack of supply, it's the major problem, the concern of the Venezuelan. For the first time since 2002, it overcomes insecurity as the main problem of the country, and not it's insecurity. It's lack of security, lack of safety is not good. It's not hasn't been solved. It's terrible, but it goes together with the protests. Many municipalities, the safety, all the measures have been destroyed, and there are kidnappings. That concern has a negative impact on the popularity of President Maduro. That's very important. That lack of popularity, of support in the last months has been linked to the coefficient of lack of supply. That's very important. That explains the fall of the popularity of Maduro. However, Venezuela has a difficult situation in Venezuela. If we go shop in Caracas, for example, lack of supply, and there we get to 60% levels of scarcity of basic regulated price regulated products. We had never seen that 60%, but you go to a supermarket, it's not that you find 60% of the stuff in a supermarket has products. In a crazy country, there's no milk, but there's champagne. There's no chicken, but there's Black Angus imported, and toilet paper, you can't find it easily, but you can find it in informal markets. In a little market, you find toilet paper. Don't think that because everybody's mentioning toilet paper, we are here importing, Please. No, that's not what happened. It's that you have to go to the informal market, store in your house. That affects, without doubt, the government. So the support of the government is a function of many variables, and that's negative, but there's some positive. There are some that help. For example, something that really I noticed in April when we did a poll about the impact, even the lack of supply and inflation impact negatively Maduro's supplies, but there is a positive. The political impact of a barricade has been negative for the protesters. The population feels that that's not the right way to protest because that's a masochist thing, because that takes the stress on the economic problems. Marisa and I, we conspired previously that we were going to allow the gentleman to speak, and then we were going to come to the gist. So we know that oil is very important to Venezuela. Venezuela has the technology, the equipment to increase production. Tell us, how do you see the oil position? I'm going to take advantage of what everybody has said. Venezuela, for a long time, thought it was Saudi Arabia. Like, if you can resolve the political problem importing, one thing is that that strategy cannot continue. You can't continue to import without paying attention to the private sector. So as imports have increased and they have multiplied spectacularly. That's not what happened with exports. Not only there has been a drop in production, but one of the most important things, there has been a drop in exports. And so above all, exports that have good international prices, because Venezuela has an exchange program with Caribbean countries, like it was mentioned, and also use some of these exports to pay debts with China. So the percentage of our exports that with international prices is dropping. But we also have problems in refinery problem, and we have the cheapest gasoline. What's happened is our demand for petroleum oil products has affected our capacity for refining. It has been compromised. And so in general terms, we can't continue to import the same amount of products that we were doing in 2012 because we don't have the dollars. But since 2012, when we had $600 billion of imports, we have a major readjustment of the volume of imports to possibly $35 billion in 2 years. It has dropped more than $20 billion, the imports. But the way how you readjust, and this is very important, is that you need to readjust the imports of the sector private, and not in the most efficient way by a devaluation of the currency. So you decided how to readjust and how and to whom. Extremely inefficient way. What happened is you affect the production capacity of the country, because that's not the way the private sector responds. Why is that important to the petroleum sector? Because like any industry, I am convinced that you can't increase production if you don't resolve the macro problem, because you need cement, transportation, food, but each one of those industries has had 30-40%. The auto industry fell 90% in the first months of the year. The cement, concrete that was expropriated by the country also fell. It dropped in the first quarter of 2014. This is happening to every industry that are essential to produce oil. So petroleum is not absolutely outside. It's endogenous. It's it's linked to it, to increase production sufficiently to try to bring more dollars to the system, we'll have first resolve the political problem, the macroeconomic problem it has, but the macroeconomic problem cannot be resolved importing. Part of the dynamics, according to the model, it cannot continue importing. But it's the only way it has to resolve the macroeconomic subject. It has to talk with the private sector because it needs to increase the private sector production capacity because it can't continue importing. China is a major player because there are major debts to Venezuela exchanged by sales of oil. Is that sustainable? It's not a matter of being sustainable or not. We owe China. We are sending China. There are 4 important markets: Venezuela, U.S. market, Indian, China, and the Caribbean. I think the variable Petro-Caribbean is very important. It's in which we have 0 international prices. Here's a political subject that serves as a safety, as like insurance, like a political insurance, international. It's important diplomatically, but what's happening is that we're selling 400,000 barrels to India. India is important for Venezuela from the point of view of, in general terms, India is filling the gap that Iran left in its imports. So we're seeing Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, all are trying to enter that market. So India is not a problem. The major ones are the U.S. and Indian markets. What's happened? The exports have dropped towards the U.S. If one has had a drop last year, it was about 150,000 barrels a day, the decrease. So you have to rebalance your export. By 60% of your exports are in international prices. So you need those dollars because at the end of the thing, Venezuela is an oil country. We export 90% of our exports are pet oil. This is how Venezuela earns a living in the international markets. So what we try to do is sell our oil in the international markets that pay us for international prices. With China, we can't do anything because it's a creditor. They pay our petroleum on cash and upfront. It's a contract, it's an agreement, so we have to comply with those requirements. But from the marketing point of view, it is important to have a presence in India and China. These are the markets of the future. One of the things that happened that we were talking at the end of point, the energy revolution in the States has had a major impact in the region. So one has to diversify. It is important to enter those markets and maintain them, but we have to, collect also. Another question. As a former minister and as a pollster, why is it possible? I was also a political consultant, so I imagine the people saying, you are giving the oil cheaper to the Caribbean, to Cuba, Nicaragua. We're looking to China. While you are going to help us, the Venezuelan, you're not doing anything to taking the subsidies away from the Caribbean. Is it possible for the Venezuelans to, to support this? They will agree to these readjustments with the Caribbean instead of them first? Thank you for the question. A very important question, because look, Venezuela, as we have seen, is in a dire situation. No, tax resources. when there is an altruistic situation between a man and wife. If the wife is doing well, so it helps the wife. But if the wife's not doing well, he can't continue giving when he doesn't have. In Petrocaribe, there the governments and people in the government are thinking incorrectly. They think we are an oil producing country, we have to continue giving them. But what should happen as when we gave them when they had need, now they have to give us. We can't continue subsidizing these countries in the Caribbean, but the right way of thinking, we have the problem now. They have to help us. But when I'm talking about solution, allow me to talk about it. But the easy solution, even though the problem is so complex, presumably, when we talk about a solution, I can tell you that is one. That's a detail, not the most important detail that we can discuss. Let's see. Venezuela today sort of distributes a lot of resources to the Caribbean. That's absurd. That from the economic point of view, that's ridiculous. But from the political point, of course, it has a political component. But the subject becomes in a debate, in a discussion. This is a subject, ITECO. The debate is ITECO. The regular Venezuelan doesn't discuss that. It doesn't discuss how much money the government is spending on Petrocaribe. They don't understand it. Perhaps the only important point is the obstacle the government has to increase the gas prices. It's a gift, a macro gift, a major gift. You are paying fortunes to distribute that gas. And the moment that the government has to go before the people and say, I'm going to increase the gas price, which is so important structurally, there are some important elements in the readjustment plan. Felipe de Arme, there are movements that are happening. The subject in the working problem, but some companies are being able to lay off people. There's not CICA 2 is not enough, but there were 40. You're making $40 million daily, but they weren't. They're giving away things. They're not resolving the problem. If they continue, they have to raise the gas price, and that problem can be massive. When we're talking about the general, the Venezuelan doesn't care about that. He wants to know about the milk. They don't have the connection that if they don't have the milk, it's because it's being given to Cuba, to the Caribbean. They don't make that link. But when their gas prices is increased, then they say, yeah, why are they raising my gas prices instead, and they keep giving these gifts to the Caribbean? That can be an interesting question. Let's go to the solution. I'm going to open the mic to questions afterwards. This can be resolved. It's possible to solve it without solving the political problem in Venezuela. These are linked, right? Felipe, please, can you tell us? Well, the economic solution is very easy, very simple. You can say, well, what do you mean? That can't be possible. The answer is because Venezuela is a very particular case. The crisis here is not a crisis of resource, a lack of resources, a balance of payments like in other places. No, the basic problem is mistakes of economic policy. political economic policy is so crazy that that you just have to bring some sanity into it in exchange, in money, currency. If you do what we have been proposing, is to have an exchange rate of free fluctuation. The exchange rate would be unified. You would have it at 20, 21 bolivars per dollar, and the government will collect about 11 GDP points. So practically, you close the gap. Starting with that. Besides, with that readjustment, you resolve the productive problem. Why has there been such a terrible, a total deterioration of the production sector? Because the bolivar the exchange rate is impossible. If it takes you 30 bolivars to produce the chicken, you can't sell it for 20. The prices. It's impossible because you have to cover your costs. If you have an overvalued bolivar, you can't produce, you can't export. Exports, non-oil exports are less than 3% of total exports. Why you need it to be around 40%? Why hasn't it happened? Because of the exchange rate. If you fix that, you fix the tax and you fix the production in great measure. What else? Even though we call ourselves socialisms, these 14, 15, we are the most neoliberal country in Latin America and perhaps the world in tax collecting matters. Colombia and Chile collect taxes, non-oil taxes, about 20% of GDP. We collect 14% of GDP. You don't charge. So, wait, if you have to have an economy, a sustainable economy, you need to have a tax model at the level of the ones that collect the least in Latin America. That's the second element, the fiscal problem. If you solve that, the currency problem is what is inflation in Venezuela is a monetary phenomenon. Besides other microeconomic details. But if you resolve the fiscal problem, you close the gap, then you don't need to issue money to finance a deficit. So then you don't have monetary inflation. So you resolve once and for all that inflation problem. And as I was saying, the productive problem is resolved in a macroeconomic model and establishing clear rules to work with the private sector. This conversation, clear rules, let's say to just take away the threat of expropriation of nationalism. It's easy to resolve it, but the question is why it hasn't been done if it can be done. Maybe you have other solutions, besides the tax fees. I would like to be as optimistic as Felipe, but that's, a hopeful pessimist. That's what I would call myself. This is a great year for no elections after a long time, for great economic changes, and a change where the political cost could be much lower if you take the medicine that you have to take and you don't take it because there are elections coming. Vicente was saying, we don't have a short-term election, notwithstanding this process of complaint, justified or not, is a delicate subject. But certainly there are protests of the young people, political unrest that have occurred a lot, that reflect a lot of economic changes that have to be done, and that answers the question, why is it not done? Why gas prices are not increased? There was talk in November that the gas prices were going to be increased, but it hasn't happened because that's is a very touchy subject to increase the gas price. It doesn't have the component that people think it has, but will increase public transportation costs, and there are variables that the government is very aware of and careful with it. So they with us, we are sitting, and I have to recognize that there is a respectful atmosphere with the government, much different than last year, but they don't land in the economic models that they don't want to change. They want to they understand that there's a problem. We're going to understand with this repression we can't keep the airlines on the ground, but we have to discuss the economic model. The economic model that Luisa explained very eloquently. We stop expropriating, we stop importing. There's a more trust, but there's a law of fair prices. They say that all businesses have a 30% margin, and they are public. And somebody sells the first class meat, and he's going to jail because you increase the price. And there is a disconnect here. You want to do things, and I think President Maduro wants to, but there's a political cost that he well knows, because the polls by Luis Vicente and other ones, they're painful measures. Economy is sick, and you have to decide if you take a little pill, homeopathic, every day, or it's a major shock, and you get sicker, but then you can see the results.
It's not
Millions. We live very well. Till 2010, nobody saw this party coming to an end. But now that the party is over, we're asking who's going to pay for the party. And the answer is that their dollars don't go enough, and they're not enough for everybody. So we have to make drastic decisions.
One last question that I have is, if the party has to be over, who's going to end it? Because what I'm hearing from each one of you this morning is that the government is not willing to change the model. The government doesn't feel the pressure. So who's going to change it? Beyond being optimistic, what I think is that if you have to try to design what would be their benchmark, what would they like to do, I think they would be dreamers, and they would never with Cuba, but with China. In other words, that would be the dream that they might have, to finance total political control with an economic system that would flow and work, and it would generate richness, production, jobs, etc. That would be their maximum dream. But it's going to have two technical problems. First of all, Venezuelan society is a much more rebellious society. And in order to concentrate power completely, the people are used to the fact that there's centralization, but at the same time, they understand that there should be participation and change. So this is a complex issue, to go to a total political control and a reduction of democracy as we've seen it, as we know it. So that element generates reactions, and it's much more complicated to take full power. But at the same time, they have another problem. So the economic situation works. You need to open up. You have to be transparent. So in other words, just to sit at the table, it's not just that. It's not just enough. In other words, why did you close such and such a plant? Well, I've got wheat. Okay, well, General so-and-so, send the wheat from here to there to the plant. That's not going to resolve the problems. They may be producing pasta, they have the wheat that's been borrowed for the company that had closed, which is the biggest one in the country, but how long can you handle that? The global importations, the exchange rate, the planning procedures, you need to have much more on the table. So I think the government is going to be working towards I think I'm much more optimistic in economy than politics. The economic dialogue, I think, in the first part is simply just to sit at the table. And they have to learn, obviously. They have to get used to it, to listen, to start taking measures. We can't wait for them to change their brain thought immediately, but at least to walk down the path. It's not as bad economically. Politically, it's much worse because political dialogue doesn't exist. The governments to accept any political proposals, for example, institutional changes in the electoral college, which to me is basic and basic necessity, or the courts, they're not going to do that. They might see some decisions that perhaps might be effective, but the government will say, oh, okay, I'm going to give the opposition party this, but this is not anything that will change the policies or the government. So I'm somewhat optimistic that we can do things on an economic level. For example, the tendencies to expropriate have to stop. They've been obviously different than the ones Chavez had. I'd like to say a little bit more about this subject. I'm not as optimistic, and the reason is when it comes to economy, I believe we have several problems that are ongoing. There is a crisis, there's a fiscal crisis, and I think there is a dollars problem. So the real problem is Jorge, who can tell us very clearly. It's a complex situation, and what I think is that there's been a change, a significant change of tone. And the problem is to execute issues, to diagnose, to find out how things have to be done. What do we need to do? And after 15 years of not talking, all of a sudden, it's perhaps asking too much that in 3 months they'd understand. The learning curve is so high that as I see the problems of dollar liquidity, for example, I think that they need time. They really don't have the ability right now to go slowly and gradually. I agree with Vincent. I think the economy will adjust. It'll adjust no matter whether you want to or not. It'll adjust through inflation or through scarcity or through products. But what I see is that what they're not doing it, the economy is going to do it for them. So what they're seeing are the results and basically are not taking any of the decisions they should have taken years ago. So the idea is that they're moving in the direction, and the direction is more or less the right direction, but I'm not so sure that they have enough time to do it as slowly and carefully and with such calm, when what I'm seeing is that they have a serious lack of dollar liquidity. They're in debt significantly, and it's now $15 billion debt. Imports, for example, they're $25 billion, and what I'm seeing is that you're importing products that are oil, for example, 150 barrels a day, and you're paying it $100 a barrel, and in Venezuela you have to sell it at less than 10 cents a gallon. What I'm seeing is that the cost of subsidizing gasoline is $20 to $30 million, Petrocaribe, $7 billion, etc. So what I'm saying is, okay, I can see that unfortunately the debt continues. They continue to get in debt to pay their imports. It's going to reach a point that at this point you're getting in such debt just to survive. How long can you do that? So at that point, China may be an important variable because if China continues to finance them, then it could last longer. But I believe that there is a limit to continue to be in debt, and I don't think they have such freedom in order to have the level of reactions that they have now. I have many other questions, but I'd like to open the floor. We have till 10:45, and I'm opening now for questions and answers. And would someone needs to use a microphone? No, no. I'd like to try to talk about this debate. Let's place this debate in Venezuela. And let's talk about United States, where 98% of all the exports from the United States are going to put this on Obama's table. And we're not touching on the fact, the subject of excessive concentration of power. How is it possible that within all of these debates, the subject that it's impossible to handle a country with that concentration of power is perhaps an untouchable subject. How is it possible that in a country, when we say a socialist, that in just the gasoline they give to other places more than any of all of the social programs in the country, if you put them all together, you give away more gasoline than in medicine, education, and different mentions. So why is it that some subjects are completely isolated from the debate and basically make this all a discussion that's not really realistic? Who would like to address the question? I think we are concentrating specifically this morning on economic issues, going to political, and the concentration of power obviously is the highest of the debates, but obviously there are very serious economic impact. I doubt that we will see complete changes to the model, particularly because you're talking about very huge interests that maintain Maduro in government. The first time around, for example, in my answer, I just talked about popularity, but there's a second level, which is a military issue, and that is a very important role in the governance of Venezuela. In other words, President Chavez was a military man. The military depended on him, however, on his government. It was his, and the military was just another actor on the stage, very close friends. In this case, President Maduro depends more on the military than Chavez. So since he was civilian, he depends more, and the military have a larger role, political and economic, different than the ones we know. And that is something here to stay. It will change Maduro. What I think is that we've tried to concentrate economic subject today, but the fact is that there's such concentration of power makes it so that the government incrementally has less credibility every single day, because there is no one will give credibility to the government on an economic level. I've heard you say, Felipe, this morning, what you've said, that lack of credibility is huge. Well, commenting a little bit on what he just mentioned, yes, it's very true. That's one of the paradoxes that exist in Venezuela. This craziness of economic policies has reached points so extreme. In other words, the subsidies to the gas prices are such that it's higher than what's being expended or used on social issues, and that's huge, particularly for a government that supposedly is socialistic in nature. The government is afraid to make these changes because my opinion is, what I see is that they're not sure that it can be resolved in a very simple manner without affecting the interests of the middle class and the poor class. Those who would be affected would be those that are corrupt, those that are connected with the government somehow to these interest groups. For example, if what we propose to change the exchanges, the fiscal situation, for example, the monetary issues in the country, not only would we be able to control inflation, but the prices could come down to a good level. And this is something that's well known. When there's hyperinflation, or when they're on the border of hyperinflation, this has been documented. Many Thomas Agents, like very well-known economists. If you raise the price of gasoline, when you apply this program, then the net effect on inflation is very, very small. Apart from the fact that the price is so cheap for gasoline, implies so many other problems, like the huge lines that you see in all the cities. So we have studied that very carefully. If you make these changes, you can resolve all the issues at the same time. And I don't agree with Luisa says, that she says it's a problem of lack of liquidity. I'm sorry, Luisa. It's not just a fact of liquidity. The problem in Venezuela is not a lack of resources. The debt is an idea that's wrong. The debt is huge. No, the debt is about a third, or most. It go as high as half of the GDP. It's handled. You can handle it compared to other countries, and obviously, what you have to pay for the debt is very high. Yes, but if you make the changes, then that would drop. In Venezuela, they pay very high interest rates on the debt, which doesn't reflect the solvency that the country could have. So my conclusion is we can resolve the issues. There's a lot of margin to working. The price of gasoline, you could get 6 points on the GDP without going to international price rates. We have another question? In the back. Marta Lucia from RCTV. I'd like to ask you, how do you see the role of the United States in the Venezuelan crisis? With the sanctions that are being asked from the government, for example, what do you think that's going to happen? So how can we have Obama put these sanctions on Venezuela? Do you think if they're going to have an effect, do you think the U.S. stance has been of non-intervention? I think more than an opinion, I think this is a public opinion in Venezuela. In other words, a sanction from the United States to Venezuela or to an official in Venezuela is not going to resolve the problem. And more than likely, it might increase the popularity here in the United States for whoever makes the proposal. It might be an internal political play, or that might be very important, particularly to Venezuelans. But the popularity of the government is not going to be affected at all in Venezuela by any sanctions applied by the United States. My experience is very definite. When Chavez announced that he was going to go to San Jose in Iraq, we did a survey. 73% of the people rejected his visit to Iraq. All of a sudden, we heard from the U.S. Department of State, the spokesperson, saying to Chavez that he shouldn't go visit Iraq. The next day, the survey was 62% of the population said that Chavez had to go to Iraq. In other words, this is a very sensitive political issue. It's not very easy to just simply say, oh, everybody's going to think this way or the way I think or because I don't agree. That doesn't work that way. The subject is very different. You have to be very careful that by trying to help, what you might cause is internal campaigns in the United States is what you're going to help, and not the situation. So perhaps more positive stimulus is more important to a dialogue and might be able to resolve the situation of Venezuela. Private sector, please, what is your opinion? I share completely what Jose Vicente has said. Additionally, I'd like to add that this government lets the evident disaster in economy. We shouldn't give them any excuses. We're not doing it in the private sector. We have to hold for strikes throughout the nations, and that's something we've done on a national basis. When you start stopping everything in the country, it's the excuse that the government would want to have. They need to learn on themselves through the pain of the people that the things they're doing are not being done properly. And let's not give them an excuse for them to say through international measures that they'll use to justify that's because of the blocking and the sanctions. They said that that's why the economy is failing. No, the economy's been failing because they haven't handled it correctly for a long period of time. Hopefully, let's not give them any other excuses. So they realize it's their fault and not international pressure. Please identify yourself. Good morning, Ramon Sanko from Express. I wanted to ask, you have about a month or so that you've been talking with the government. What is the balance of the results? Do you have an agenda where you reached any agreement that you'd like to reach in midterm? And the freeze that we've seen at the political table, do you evaluate that as well based on the dialogue that you've been able to have? And Mr. Leon, I'd like to ask to have an opening of the economic situation, an increase in gasoline, that could also affect, or how could it affect the military sector based on the claims that have been made and the issues on gasoline and imports, etc., and the situations that have been created because of all the contraband that goes on? Well, those are two questions, but we're very generous. We'll answer. Okay, I'll answer. In the last 3 months, you said you can't see results after so many years of doing things wrong, but we have advanced tremendously. And when I say that, we've liberated prices that were very, very high, years of not reviewing the situation. There's all kinds of new systems for alternatives for exporting, for example, for currency, labor issues. That, if, for example, at least you can have justified requests. That would be before you could not do that. There is a climate of respect that I think they're facing the business community. They've changed the laws to some degree that before you couldn't, for example, rent out anything to the local processes. So I think that things have changed, and I'd like to think that many things have been done, but it's a very, very difficult road. And in 3 months, we can't improve what has gone on for years. Constantly people say, well, when are we going to see the results? When are you going to see this situation? How is it going to improve? Well, we're going to continue doing things correctly, and obviously you'll start to see results after a period of time, which obviously hasn't happened yet. We haven't seen the results. We've had good dialogues. We can advance even more so, and we certainly hope that we stay at the table. The business community will continue proposing solutions, perhaps that are much more profound. And as so far, we've had a great show, but now we have to reconstruct the puzzle that the country has had. I think that the increase of gasoline prices is not basically being blocked by either military issues or the black marketing or contraband. No, the subject of gasoline is blocked because they're afraid of the political impact it's going to have to that increase, and it's a political cost. The myth was created with Caracaso that when you raise the price of gasoline, what's going to happen is what's going to happen at that problem they had. The price of transportation became exorbitant. If you check any of the historic moments, prices have been raised. Caldera did it and nothing happened. If you do it properly, if the people are informed, it will be done correctly. As Jorge says, then after so many years of doing it wrong, obviously it's going to be much more difficult and more expensive to change the situation. But I think there is a hope that that can be done. The government will have to work, and I understand clearly that Maduro can't say tomorrow I'm raising the prices without preparing previously to make people aware of the situation. It has to work. But obviously, it can't be done very quickly. We'll probably see this happen perhaps in a few months. The indicators have to be very clear. The government is going to begin a campaign on this issue. It had started, and I think all the protests that you're seeing right now might be a cause to freeze it, because obviously the situation is very complex. It makes it extremely difficult to make decisions that they consider politically dangerous. The other thing that I'd like to mention is that the subject of contraband is not something that can't be resolved. The cost of gasoline in Venezuela is less than 10 cents a gallon. In Colombia, it's almost $4 a gallon. In Venezuela, there is no way you're ever going to reach that price to eliminate the possibility of contraband. The only thing you can do, which is what the minister has said, is to increase the price of gasoline at least to reach the production cost. Right now, you're selling it at a loss. And that's a very limited increase. So we're talking about a very different dimension. Thank you, Diana Moreno. My question is to Luisa. I don't think that the government has so much time for what? To fall in the abyss that was already referred to? Or for a military intervention? We can't imagine that Maduro is going to be harakiri, politically level. Why would he do that? Well, one of the things that Felipe mentioned is that he felt that we are at the edge of an economic collapse. So I think they have time to avoid that economic situation, which will become politically untenable. Now, what do I mean? I think that the variable that's missing is the unemployment variable. Right now, you have inflation. We have levels of scarcity that are very huge. We have a lack of security. We have a very complicated situation. So I think the government is very happy to hear that the manifestations and protests have not the voters, their constituency is not protesting to some level. It's basically the middle class that's complaining. These are students, they don't see a future in their country. There's very strong reasons and good reasons why they're protesting. The interesting factor is why don't we see other protests that are more important? So what I think is with the adjustments that we've seen have been particularly strong towards the middle class. So what is the variable that I think is important? Unemployment. And that's why I feel that if the government doesn't resolve the issues of the private sector, to give you an example, the automotive industry, for example, that affects maybe 80,000 people. If that sector is not funded, several of the countries have had to close the doors. They're saying they're leaving Venezuela. They're still paying the salaries of their employees, but they basically don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. So they will be closing the doors. They're going to see that all of the companies that provide Toyota and Ford and General Motors, and then you're going to talk about 80,000 unemployed. I don't think that level of unemployment is what's not sustainable. As far as experiences in other countries and other parts of Latin America, when an unemployment reaches concerning levels, that's when you start seeing a socially complicated issue. That's the variable. The economic collapse is when the private sector says, okay, we've done it, we're going to close it, Santa Maria, we're done. And then you're going to see massive unemployment. Now, we haven't reached that point. My opinion is that I see that there is a dialogue, that they are taking the proper path with a lot of problems to execute what they have to do. The diagnosis of what it is they have to do. I believe the learning curve, as we've mentioned, after 15 years of doing things one way, all of a sudden they feel that you have to change it. They don't know how. They don't realize the political cost. They don't want to increase the gasoline price. So they're in a situation where they're taking very slow steps because they don't really understand or know. They're not measuring the cost. A government that is facing the economic variables, the social issues that they're facing, not just this government, any government faced with what they're facing, I can well understand that they're scared. They're seeing, let's raise the gasoline price. Well, that's really difficult. So I am not sure how long they have to be able to change it. How many more days can they take things gradually? I think at some point it's going to happen where the private sector is going to say, that's it, I'm done. The airlines are saying it now. They're saying we're leaving. So how much more time do they have? When are the car manufacturers going to leave? The drug companies. That's when I think that things will be much more complicated. And something else, Peter, we don't have huge unemployment because 8 years ago there's a decree that you can't put people on the street. That's why it's an artificial rate. It would be much higher.
Juan, another question. Good afternoon. Two questions. I'm Juan Cortiñas from Strategies. They have mentioned expropriations. I read yesterday that 10 farms were going to be returned to their original owners. Do you see in the future that some of the expropriations will be returned to their rightful owners? There are lawsuits, million-dollar lawsuits abroad about it. Do you see that coming? Jorge Luis Vicente mentioned briefly to the new law, the new labor law that I understand has several negative elements for the private sector. One, to that promotes absenteeism. Is that law going to be more flexible so labor costs won't increase? and reduce production. What Luisa is saying is clear. The government doesn't want to touch labor. Says let's not touch about that. They understand that unemployment is a very critical point. What they're allowing is that you can lay off people who are stealing or doing, incredible things, but there is no flexibility there, and they don't want to charge a subject. Unfortunately, it's a very complex subject. As to returning property, if that's happening, I don't know. In labor subject, they're not going to renegotiate, they're not going to discuss it. That's the law, it stays. That's not going to change. At least that's what I think. What's going to happen, they're going to be a little bit more flexible in the application. Not that they're going to be, but they actually are. And as to layoffs or, firing people, that was untouchable. But they understand the need to resolve some specific problems. And that's not only about labor law. They have been very informal trying to implement that adjustment, but covertly that they did it with the prices. Prices, more than 30 days, almost 2 months went by since the time when the first meeting they told some producers, oh, you can increase your prices. And the answer was, what do you mean raise prices? You increase the prices. It is regulated by law, by the official press. You are the one who need to raise prices. No, you calm, quiet. You increase the prices, but I can't decree it. I can't make it. I'm not going to get involved with you. I'm not going to do anything with you. You do it, and it'll happen. So that's happened, but that has come out from the government lately. But 200, 300%. The increases are way above than what we thought was going to happen. They are being more flexible in negotiation, but saying that everything is not as clear as it should be. I mean, so you really don't know what's going to happen. The situation the situation was bad. It went to horrible. It's going to go back to bad. That's what's going. Nothing is being resolved. Herbert Torres. I am the brother of Minister Terros. Well, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It's just a comment with a question at the end. I seem to think that this government can't make the changes that Venezuela needs, and it's going to break. It's because there's corruption, connections, nationals, internationals, all the types, drug trafficking, internal, everything. One is an ideological vision that makes it impossible for them to understand market mechanisms, but that they continue, if not with the markets, by, SICAD. There is a lack of bureaucracy. The country needs a minimum bureaucracy to function reasonably well. And there's another fact, a lack of leadership. There is no leadership to carry out the transformation that Venezuelan Maduro, Chavismo, cannot present to the country the challenges that the country needs to face. They are unable to do it. But do you think they are able to do it? Do you think in 1 year or two that Venezuela, having made the transition, to being able to reorganize the economy and making it function reasonably efficiently, they can maintain and they can keep the political control? I've been trying to ask that question all morning, but you have done it more elegantly. We didn't want to answer that question. Well, let's see. I was very optimistic. That's what I said. There are ways to resolve it. It's very easy to resolve the economic problem. In fact, the situation have reached the point where the solution doesn't only have to be economic, it has to be political. The government has to take strong measures to resolve the political problem, and the measures have to do with, like Ulysses, he strapped himself to the ship because when it was going through the Siren's Sea, he tied himself to the mast. So no matter how much the siren sang, he could not jump into the sea. He was able to deliver his goods because he was tied himself. That's what the government has to do, tie themselves to the mast. The central bank has to put someone who is not a government official because if the economic changes can have an impact, they have to be credible. They have to have credibility. So, but in the political arena, these changes have to be made. You have to tie yourself to the mast and put someone with credibility in the defense of the problem, the prosecution, if you are intelligent, smart, and make a very difficult decision. And there I would make a call to the government through in this event, this good event, so they make those changes. If they don't make those changes, I'm very pessimistic, even more than my colleagues. I would give them 3 to 4 months. So if the government doesn't make major changes, this will fall on its own. Well, I'm looking at you as, as a seer. Tell us what the future holds. To imagine that it's going to be a modern model. It will resolve the imbalance. Well, it wouldn't happen if the government changes either. It's not a concern with the government of Maduro, President Maduro. Even changing because of the innate nature of Venezuela. It's not what we had before. We had a totally modern country. No, we didn't have that. Now it's worse. But there's a little problem with dependency, with oil, with corruption. But this didn't come about with Chavez, but it just exploded with Chavismo. And even this is tough. We lived with a porno magazines, and now we live with explicit sex. Let's say it. But it's not that we hadn't been in that situation before. The subject, what I think, is that the reality is different than the conventional country, is the oil that we have. What happened is, like Luisa said, you can have debt, commercial debt, trade, expropriations is very important, dividends. The external debt is very important, but it's not the worst, if you compare it to our capacity. But what happens? They're not going to pay. They're not going to pay that debt. Not this government. No government will pay 100% of the debt. It likes that $13 billion of debt are going to be paid, or 6, 7, 8 pesos a dollar. No, that's a strategic decision. You might just to maintain the balance of things, but they know it's impossible. The government is not going to pay. The trade debt is not going to be paid in full, but maybe just a part. What they're going to do is to calm the people, the nerves. What they're going to do is say, I have money for the future, but not for the mess I got involved with last years when I pay more than $70 billion. But it's not true that we imported $70 million, but $70 billion, they stole a great part of it, and not only the Chavez people. Everything happened there. Who's responsible for that? The government. The government is the guilty party, but there is corruption. Everything, because that is the regular response of the mechanisms of the control. But $70 million, that debt, you don't owe the whole debt because many people received the authorizations to get it. Rationally, I'm not criticizing. You're protecting the black market too. There are the guarantees of protection after charging 30, 60, 80, pretend to get it back at 30. They're going to charge you plus the interest. There's a problem that has to be negotiated. So we're going to pay just 30% now. I'll quiet you, you'll be happy, and then I get more money to continue importing, and then we'll negotiate the other 30%, 70%. Many people are willing to do it, many countries. When you find there are people that are willing to negotiate, you understand that theoretically that the debt is going to be paid off. That is not very clear. So we're very far from the Chinese model. I'm going to make two comments with what Gerbert said. I agree with Vicente to think that Venezuela is going to change to resemble the other countries in the region. That's not possible. If Venezuela can function where the oil sector is part, it's not a failed state, but with an oil sector that represent our liquidity and fiscal. There are other countries like that. But what I do think with this government, to think that that can happen is reasonable. I don't think this government, as you're saying, is diagnosis, implementation, personnel. If we follow the models of the other markets in Latin America, that's unrealistic. No. We're going to, a failed state oil country. We see how it happens. That's an area where I do think that there is a faster pragmatic attitude. It should be from the oil sector. There's indication that they are understanding because it's the only way of getting out of this mess. What this is going to open is with the oil sector. But where is the oil sector going to be? I'm looking at the global oil sector. If I see the Canadians increasing their export, Latin America has lost 15 billion. There is heavy oil, has crude oil. The heavy crude is imported by the U.S. We should not be affected by the energy revolution in U.S. But what's happening is a market share revolution, and the Canadians have increased it by 90 billion barrels. Well, especially, and if shale is being implemented and developed, that is going to change. That with a pipeline that goes from Canada to the Gulf, where all the importers of the heavy crude oil are located, there will be a competition over market share that that Canada is selling for about 20% of GDP, and Venezuela 5% for GDP, and we're selling our we are discounting it at $3-4. And Mexican petroleum, which is what we export, is the same quality as Maya. Maya is discounting at 9 to 8. So, well, we're seeing it in our basket, so it's a low. I see more competition from other producers who marketing import is important. The oil market is becoming more complex, where the companies that have wing of marketing have a greater leverage. The ones in Venezuela say there's no other way for Venezuela than opening more than what is being opened, but to increase production in Venezuela, okay, basically that it's a very, very heavy crude oil that you have to mix it with the lightweight one. You need to import the lower level, the lighter crude oil, the lighter. What I see, more for it's more pressure for Venezuela and the type of product it sells, and the way how the global market is changing. What I tell myself in the oil sector, they have to do a lot more than what we're doing. I understand that they understand it, but I'm not sure that the oil business is a 2-3 year oil. To increase production, you have to invest today. You have to make investments that are not being done, and you have to clarify the debt problem. I don't think Venezuela has a solvency problem. They have a liquidity problem in dollars. They have $20 million in reserves. You have about $200 billion in cash. You have about 600 to 800 million dollars in gold in the international market. So if tomorrow you need dollars, maybe $5 billion, you don't. Where are you going to get them? It's an administration problem. The economists are saying, how much money do they have outside the international reserves? When we see the percentages, it's about $20 billion. Part of the money is in the Chinese fund. It's very restricted, can only be used for imports or Chinese investments in oil. It's not liquid. It's only for negotiations or investments with China. And you have to see dollars versus bolivares. And what I see yesterday, they announced that they're going to issue $500 billion. Countries don't do it. A country can't say that it's going to issue $500 billion. For what? To pay all those investments, to continue importing and subsidizing. You need debt to give dollars to pay the crude oil, maybe $15 billion. But the idea is that we're not sure that that's going to continue in the future at the same rate it's happening, without there being fundamental changes, at least in your capacity to export. Last question. Somebody had their hand raised. There's a microphone. Thank you. Good morning, Catrice. I understand that there could be a change in the government economy. How do you see, you gentlemen who live in Venezuela and see this daily, the violation of human rights? This is a subject I work on daily. Every day there are more arrests, more people dead, the violation of human rights. Where is the line where the government has to understand that you can solve a problem when the violations of human rights are happening on a daily basis? How do you see that? So where is that line where something can be improved when every day everything is breaking down further? This is a very complex question, and the answer very short. Very short. Herbert, I'm going to say something brief. I think the economy is more stubborn than any revolution, and having to adapt to the changes that have to be done. They're doing the least possible to maintain their political support. But the economy, at the end of things, it says, hey, I'm here. Violation of human rights is a very complex subject, and you have to live it to understand it. In this moment, to live and because of the human rights issues, the country can't move forward. That is very difficult subject to address. We can't sit in an economic discussion when people are being killed. The businessmen, they got us together to resolve the economic problem. It hurts me. It really hurts me to see people being killed. But there is opportunity for everything, infiltrating people. Some are students and are not, or yes. But what's happening in Venezuela, the protests, it's very complex, but of course, no country can move forward without, with this violation of human rights. I want to thank you for being here, for joining us, for explaining, for talking about a subject that frequently cannot be explained. Thank you very much.